All right. Good morning. Welcome to Men Who Mobilize, a live webinar and recording with four of my favorite men. So one is missing this morning, but want to just thank you for being here this morning to have a conversation. And as each of you know, I'm just going to briefly introduce you and ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. But the purpose of this conversation and others that I hope to follow is basically just to extend or elaborate on the work that PowHERhouse has been doing to build strong women and strong leaders. So how do we take that conversation to the next level? And I've been having that discussion with each of you individually, asking for your input, and I really want to explore it, dissect it, and I know how far that we've gotten in the past 5 years, really focused on women, and I really want to take that conversation to the next level and say, okay, what are we doing to support and to impact high caliber leaders, men, women, boys, girls, black, white, blue, purple. What are we doing to just continue to lead at a higher level? So that's the context of this conversation. And Corey, I'm going to start by introducing you. On my top left, I'm not sure about yours, but Corey Sigvaldason is a good friend of ours and a colleague of mine from Kamloops, BC. And I'm just going to start out by saying Corey is changing the world through education, leadership, and entrepreneurship. Corey, what do you want to add to that? What do you want people to know about you?
You know, I've been a serial entrepreneur. I grew up in a family of women's, and I have my wife and 2 daughters. So I kid that I've been swimming in the estrogen ocean for all my life. And it's given me a unique perspective that I hope I can bring to the group.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I know you have a pretty hectic travel schedule, so I'm super happy that you've made time. And on my top right, I want to welcome Mike Rowlands. And I'm going to say a little bit about Mike. I've known Mike since the early 2000s, long before I even understood the term social innovation, social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, when I really was floundering to find my people. And I'm really happy to say that Mike was one of those people and has been a friend and advisor ever since. Mike is a convener, advisor, philosopher. He is the president and CEO of Junction Strategy, and he's the board chair of Hollyhock and a director of the Social Ventures Circle. Mike, thank you for being here. What would you like to add to that brief introduction?
My pleasure being here. I really like Corey's phrase of swimming in the estrogen ocean. I like it. Definitely caught my attention. I was going to phrase it slightly differently and say that I've been surrounded by powerful women in my career as a social entrepreneur, in my family life, and I have learned over the last number of years a great deal more than I ever thought there was to learn about the privilege that I carry by virtue of being a white male. And especially now that I've got a few little gray hairs cropping up, the assumed authority that I have when I walk into a room is something to hold very, very carefully. So I've made it part of my business life and part of my thinking and part of my personal intentions around how I show up to try to be one of those people that creates space for the women in the room, for the people of color in the room, for those who are advantaged in different ways. So I try to be a bit of a space maker to the extent that I can.
Cool. Thank you so much for making time to be here today. You know, I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to briefly mention that Rory Holland was part of our media campaign for Men Who Mobilize, which we will be sharing throughout the rest of the month of June. And I will be asking Rory to step in on a future webinar. He was not able to be with us this morning, and want to thank him for his participation. I want to introduce you to obviously someone who's a man who mobilizes in my life, personally and professionally, my partner, Ben Smith. And just a little snippet about Ben, I would describe him as a thoughtful, introspective, creative, who uses his life experience to help others explore and navigate their own journey. Now, I'm not sure how Benjamin will introduce himself. That's always a bit of a wild card. No, I'm kidding, but thank you for being here and yeah, just being part of the conversation. What would you like to add to that short introduction?
Well, two things. So yeah, I mean, as far as what I've learned about women, I've learned a lot from just following behind you, carrying your bag. Yes, dear. Yes, dear. Yeah, okay. Yes, dear. So I've learned a lot doing that. But also, I'm just a guy that kind of goes through my life, and I'm an observer, and I'm a reflector, and I'm just like constantly just the way people are living their lives and the things people are doing and saying and putting their time and effort. I'm just like, what the F? You know, so that's kind of my thing. Is I'm really a reflector, and I notice what people are doing. So I'm quite thoughtful in that way. I'm just like, why are people doing that? Like, why are people acting like that or treating people that way? So I'm constantly questioning.
Yeah, I definitely see the process that you use is that observation, a lot of reflection and introspection, and then that ends up coming out in your writing, in what you create. So yeah. So a few interesting perspectives coming at it, you know, and which is what I always love to do, is to have a conversation and bring different perspectives into it. I'm going to jump into our questions. Now, I have kind of pre-warned you a little bit about what these questions are in hopes that you'd have a chance to give them some thought. So I'm just going to simply read out the first question so that I get it right and hopefully make it as understandable as possible. So I think that the four of us, and likely anyone who is on this call and who will watch this call, would consider themselves to be big believers in the benefits of the small shifts that we've been working towards for many, many years. The small shifts, the positive ripples that we have all been working at for many years in terms of trying to create positive change, social impact. So where I would like to go with this conversation is over and above those small shifts that we have been working towards. I believe that we are being called as leaders with a higher sense of urgency right now. That's my personal belief, where some, what I phrase, tsunami material is now needed. So we've got the small shifts, we've got the positive little ripples happening, and that's all well and good. But I do feel like there's some tsunami material that's needed. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on that, tell us a little bit about if there's anything that you're currently focused on, thinking about maybe a little differently, or leaning towards in terms of creating a bigger wave of change. Is there anything that is new underfoot for you at this time? And Corey, I don't mean to put you on the spot, you know, starting with you again, but I am going to start with you and just wonder how that question hit you and what it makes you think about.
Well, the first thing it makes me think about is if you look at any of the major game changers throughout history, when we're talking about shifting from those small incremental changes to creating positive movements that change the world, we know that throughout that process, and especially early on and as it gains momentum, there's going to be resistance, there's going to be challenge and obstacles in front of us. And it's important to realize that, you know, because to keep the optimism and keep the faith and hope in the purpose of what's driving people for that tsunami of change and that positive movement, we can't go in with Pollyanna thinking. I think what we need is Pollyanna wisdom, and that's keeping optimism, but being wise that we're going to have resistance through the process. And anyone that's done, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, you name it, those people had significant resistance and hardship in the process, but kept the path. And I think we need to know that going in up front, that this is going to be difficult. And rather than doing the easy thing, we need to do the right thing. So that's just kind of the mindset I think we need to approach this with, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. So be optimistic, but be optimistic, but expect resistance, and keep the path. Just stay the course. I think that I always think of resistance. For me, when I encounter resistance, and as you all know, that does. You all hear about it. So I try to link it back to, I always learn from my body. And so when I know that it is only under resistance that my body gets better, it changes and adapts, and that increases my performance. So I like what you said about resistance. We tend to just jump into the fact that resistance is either a bad or a good thing. But I challenge us to think about it in a way that it causes us to perform better at a higher level. So,
and with that, if I can add one thing, we need to approach it from a point of learning. And if we're going to be learning, there has to be an openness that we approach it with, not a profound agenda we're going forward with. Mm-hmm. I think we need to go into it with a position of openness, to learn ourselves, as well as put forth whatever education or viewpoints we feel need to be shared, and do it from a place of respect. Even if people are going to differ in opinions and positions they're starting from, we need to approach it with respect, and that takes a position of love. And there's certain universal truths across cultures, gender, whatever it is. And, love is one of those values that every culture and position seems to value. Trust, respect. And I think we need to remember that, especially as there's going to be positive debate.
Yeah, really good points. Mike, I'm going to swing over to you from ripples to tsunami. Yeah, what's up? What's up in your world?
So I think it's important to say first that I don't consider myself an expert in this work. I've never deeply studied feminist theory. I'd be hard pressed to articulate the waves of feminism and the distinctions between them. So I speak from the perspective of an entrepreneur and a marketer, and a philosopher. My academic training is in philosophy, and critical thinking, and just noticing patterns in the way people think and the way people behave. And I have noticed a shift that I think is profoundly important, and that inspires me with hope. And that shift is this a transition, I think, from sort of a moralistic perspective on feminism toward a more celebratory perspective. And I saw it a lot in the Me Too movement and the rallies and the gigantic marches. I mean, it was just extraordinary how many people were mobilized toward those marches. And they were certainly activist marches, and yet there was something really celebratory and happy and festive about the tone of a lot of the conversation around those marches. The hats were an incredible symbol of positive camaraderie and of coming together. And I think this celebratory tone is a really important shift, because it's inherently inclusive, because it tells a positive story, and we all want to be part of a positive story. There is always important space for activists and activism and sort of pushing the edges of a conversation. And those can be divisive because they go straight at points of disagreement. But when we get into this celebratory tone, there's something very inclusive that finds places of agreement. And I think that can be really, really empowering. One organization where I see that showing up in a just an absolutely beautiful way is the SheEO movement that Vicky Saunders started, which is this incredible model of just crowdsourcing investment support for women entrepreneurs from women. And the successes they've had, some of the case stories that they have, the camaraderie among the women who are participating as funders and those who are beneficiaries. And then the incredible way they think about assigning the funds that get invested. So they will crowdfund for 5 entrepreneurs, but the 5 entrepreneurs have to decide how the money is divided, and they're not allowed to divide it equally. So they have to have a healthy collaborative conversation to decide which of the enterprises requires the most money. And there's something in traditional entrepreneurialism that is has a zero-sum competitive tone, and I think again, not overstepping my understanding of feminism, but my observation has been that there's more a positive sum tone. How can we develop an outcome that lifts everybody? And SheEO is just a gorgeous model of that. And then the last thing I'd say is, ripples do count, daily actions do count, and each of us has to take responsibility for the part that we can play. So thinking carefully about how we behave and how we show up, and when we show up. It's years now that I've been refusing to moderate panels at conferences unless there was at least one woman on the panel. It's probably 10 years since I set that rule for myself. More recently, I've set a rule that I won't moderate a panel unless there's at least one person of color on the panel as well. That's a little thing that I can do, but the impact that it has at the front of the room can be pretty remarkable, right? It can have a really significant ripple effect. So just thinking about those little things that we can do, and knowing when it's our moment to shut up, sit down, and listen and ask questions instead of pretending to have all of the answers.
Yeah, just reflecting back on a couple of things that you said, and then I'm going to go on to Ben and then encourage you to also open up, because I'm sure I have things, not only me, to reflect on what each of you have said. So I want to make sure and give that space for the 3 of you to do the same. I as well have always tried to take that stance of fighting for what I'm for rather than what I'm against. I've always taken the stance to try to celebrate the positive role models, the positive, encounters and interactions that yes. I see, because I think positive always will come out stronger exponentially than negative. So I really like that point that you made. And I think even the level of, the conversation and the dialogue for me is, you made the point, you're not an expert in feminism, and quite frankly, neither am I. But even that conversation, I'd like to elevate that to the next level. And you then, you said it best, like, it's really a conversation about how do we leave no one behind? How do we achieve, rather than separation, unity and bringing all people together? And, but I liked also that your reminder about the importance of daily actions, and I think they don't come to mind to some people. Like, you're just a little commitment that you made to yourself as a leader. You surveyed your sphere of influence. You do happen to get asked to moderate and sit on, many panels. And so you just, took a look at that and said, okay, personal rule for myself, won't do it. And if we, made those type of decisions as to just what little things that we can make those personal rules about, we can just keep helping to change the dial. And I really appreciate that. So I do hope that inspires, each of us to, take a look at those rules. And Ben, I'm going to ask you to reflect on that same, and then I just want to open it up for a couple of minutes to see if you guys had reflections on each other. But again, the question was just in terms of, not letting go of or stopping the continuous little shifts every day that we're doing, or the ripples. How might we elevate it up to what I feel we're being called to make a larger impact, a greater tsunami of change? And just wondering what came to mind for you when you reflected on that question.
Well, if we're talking about a tsunami type change in on a global level in the world, I was looking online right before this. There's 7.7 billion people in the world. And 500,000 years ago, up until 10,000 years ago, we were mostly, our survival depended on community. Our survival depended on us being a unified front to survive. That was just the way it was up until about 10,000 years ago. And so I think we need to return to that. And I think the way to return to that, I mean, there's 7.7 billion people in the world. We don't have to be the ones to figure out how to change the world. There's brilliant minds out there. There's unbelievable inspiration that people would have if they felt like they had the platform and they felt like they had the stability. I think every one of us in the world needs to create the stability within ourselves to be able to support one another so that we can access these 7.7 billion minds to come up with huge solutions. And I think as far as tsunami type change, we need to kind of look at it in that way. Like there's brilliant minds, there's unbelievable inspiration coming from people, or possible from people that don't have the opportunity, because we've created a world in which there's pockets of this, and there's there's not enough inclusion, there's not enough opportunities for people. But creating these huge changes, I think, starts by creating huge changes within ourselves that stops being so individually minded. And so, like, we need to shift the paradigm, from this paradigm of success of me and money and this and that, to being success as a community, and what I could do to support you so that you could support them, so that we could support everybody. And that's how we're going to make. And I think when that happens, and when we create that kind of that shift in the paradigm, or what success really looks like, when success looks much more inclusive, then I think all the world problems will be fixed very, very quickly, because there's so many people out there. There's so many brilliant minds, and change happens very quickly when the wave starts building. So I'm very much an optimist that way, and I believe that the world is going to be unbelievably beautiful in a very short time. But it's just a matter of, we all have to get on the same page and have that same type of mindset that we had 500,000 years ago, or up to 10,000 years ago, where it's like, we're a community here.
Yeah, I think what jumps out for me in what you said was, many years ago, success equaled survival, right? And then somehow that got flipped to success equals me surviving, survival of the fittest. And at one point, and in many parts of the world, its success does still equal, like, how do we work together to make sure that we're stronger together? And I do think that there is evidence of those communities rebuilding. How are we so stronger together through community? But I love what you said about redefining success, and I always appreciate your optimism. I do.
Well, I'll just say this. I think, cause again, I'm an observer, and I listen to what people are saying, and I watch, and I see people are they're kind of confused and they're distracted, but it's like, there's all these huge things going on, but they're so easy to fix. So I think that we need to not discount the individual in helping. In everybody's going to play a huge role in this, but we all got to start within ourselves. Be grounded enough to realize it's not just about me; it's about everyone.
So I'm just going to open it up, like just for a couple of minutes, because I'm curious if you had thoughts or reflections or anything that came up for you that you wanted to add based on what each other had replied.
Can I share something that it was a thought, and it came to some research I did on the redwood cedar. So those massive trees that grow, and it points to kind of the two things I picked up from Mike and Ben, in that Mike talked about, as individuals, we still have this ripple effect. We don't live in an invisible bubble. So we all change the world in some way just by showing up, right? It's when we can bring that to a conscious level that's driven by whatever that calling or purpose is for us. And Ben talked about the community, and the interesting thing about redwoods, and they get this massive growth and they're so strong and stable. But what I found is their roots are actually very shallow. They go very wide. And the strength and why they're able to stand and grow like they are is they all interlock with each other. Yeah. And there's something about that community. We can't do it on our own. We can be good, strong presence and do our individual thing like the one tree, but it's through the combination and strength together that we actually can grow. And without that, if we get too much into the me, it's, we're going to be a small tree or, a blade of grass rather than, this bigger thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a super cool visual. Like
and it speaks to the power of systems, right? The power of systems to lift individual members up, but also the power of systems to dominate and overbear, which is the downside. And while I think each of us, many of us have agency and capacity to drive change, but because of the systems that we live in, some of us do not have that agency and do not have that capacity to drive change. And so, I think there are still extraordinarily big, bold shifts that need to happen in the way we think about community, in the way we think about capitalism, in the way that, as you point out, Charlene, in Western society, we tend to have this very individualistic sort of sense of what success looks like, which is a very Western mode of thinking and a very capitalist mode of thinking. But these are really powerful, dominant, long enduring systems that are hard to critique, and they're hard to live separately from when they make up so much of our day-to-day reality. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also important to look at cultures and communities and systems that operate in a different way. I've been doing a little bit of work the last few years with Indigenous communities and leaders, mainly here in British Columbia, and the learning from that entirely different worldview, that different way of seeing, different way of knowing. It's beautiful to juxtapose those sorts of traditions and perspectives against the sort of capitalist frame in which I've sort of grown up and built my working career. Mm-hmm. There's so much for us to learn from cultures that aren't ours.
Yeah, it's so true, to be craving the development of a new system while living within an existing one, right? Mm-hmm. And Corey,
and you mentioned my affiliation with Social Venture Circle earlier, which is mainly American network of social entrepreneurs and impact investors. And we've just rebranded SVC over the last year, and the new logo takes inspiration from Buckminster Fuller and the geodesic dome design. And one of Fuller's quotes is one that really inspires and engages me. He says, if you want to change a system, don't try to change it from within. Create a new system that makes the old system obsolete. So what does the new inclusive system look like? How do we start to create communities, enterprises, practices that create a viable, healthy alternative to the systems that are not supporting us today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great. Corey, I love the word interlocking. I really, really love the word interlocking. So I'm gonna jump into our second question, being mindful of our time. And this is a question that I did ask you to reflect on in the online profiles that we did up for each of you, So I'm hoping that maybe we can take it slightly further if there's anything more you have to say about it. But my question in the profile was just asking you to reflect on what you felt the number one conversation obviously there's many conversations, but the number one conversation you felt men and women should be having at this time. And I'll remind you what you said in the profile, and then I'm going to ask you if you had anything you wanted to say further about that. So Corey, when I asked you that question, what's that number one thing? You basically answered in the profile by saying, how can men be better men and learn from women and their strengths? How can men support women and leverage our own strengths? So that's a loaded reply, and one that I deeply appreciate. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
You know, I looked at it last night and again this morning, and I was like, to be honest, I was like, wow, where'd that come from? What was I thinking? And as I tried to really internalize and think about it, I think the first thing I'd say is there's a certain degree of ignorance that I would have in trying to understand women or someone from a different culture, race, or physical ability. You know, someone who's grown up with cerebral palsy and in a wheelchair. I come from it from a place of complete ignorance, and I think we need to just acknowledge and realize, you know, there's this much we really know in the whole scheme of things, and that's where I think we need to go with a learning mindset and be open to change and learning, and then do it with respect and love. And every single person has a story, and we don't necessarily know this story and why they have the feelings and belief systems and, you know, the behaviors that they manifest. So we need to first come in from a place of vulnerability and ignorance to be open to learning. And from that, we can then, we're stronger together like those redwoods. And when we have a better understanding of, you know, the others that we're trying to come into community with and get a better understanding so we can move better together and stronger. It's like, and the capitalist model and the existing model is one where the pie is, it's a zero-sum game is the way they think. And it's, you know, this size, and we think like, oh, if we change something, someone has to lose for someone to win. And that's just false. You know, we can actually expand the pie or create another pie that's this big over there, right? And it's just changing views, but it really, to me, we all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses, and to really support each other, but it has to be from a point of vulnerability and openness to learning first. Otherwise, we just get into conflict because we're pushing our own agendas and biases through our own lens, and I don't think that serves anyone well.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said about story, and I think one of the things that I've always like deeply enjoyed doing, and probably one of the reasons why I chose like the line of work, or why, you know, PowHERhouse is a media platform, is because I love to understand people's story. Like, I love to understand where you're coming from, a little bit about your background, your experience. And so what I've found is, you know, the people that I have the closest relationships with, honestly, it likely started out because I asked you for the opportunity to learn about your story and maybe write about it or profile you in some way. And with the women I work with, you know, a huge part of the work really is helping them to get really, really clear and concise about what their story is, so that as we communicate with each other, it's kind of like, if we just had this symbol like that, we could like show each other, so that you just immediately knew, this is who I am as a leader. This is what I'd like you to know about me. This is where I'm coming from. And this is my perspective. And so I feel like if I can help someone to get really clear about how they'd like to communicate that to another leader, it takes away so much of the, I don't know, like the ineffectiveness or the games or the, like just coming like, here's my heart, my soul, and who I am on a bit of a platter. Can we just start from here? And that's, that's what I really love to do. So a bit of a tangent, but I love what you said about, we don't know each other's story. And part of our job as a leaders, is to, I think, to learn a bit about that story and where we're coming from.
Right. And I appreciate it. Brought up an image in my mind as you're explaining it so eloquently, like you do, Charlene, is what we see is that tip of the iceberg. And when we engage in learning this story, more of the iceberg comes above the surface. Yeah,
so true. Mike, I'm just going to remind you what you said when you answered that question. Part of it you alluded to a little bit earlier today. So, you said we're definitely in a historic cultural moment with movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matters, and others around us. There's a fragile and for many very challenging societal dialogue about what inequity is and what it's anchored in terms of social justice and historical wrongdoing. There are many who are rightly and justifiably angry at social conditions that protect and preserve privilege in its many forms. I acknowledge and respect this anger, whether it shows up as mere frustration or vehement rage. This is the moment that we're in right now. And I agree. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I have learned that it's important for me to allow space for that anger. It simply must be expressed. And at the same time, I hope the conversation men and women are engaging in is about how we come together in equitable relations. There is value in the masculine, and as there is value in the sacred feminine. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about your thoughts around that coming together, the masculine, the feminine, or whatever that brings up for you this morning.
Well, there's a couple of thoughts this morning. One, since I wrote that in response to your questions, there has been a report published from the National Inquiry here in Canada into missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country. And a word has been used in a lot of the coverage about that report. And the word is genocide. And that word has, it's fascinating and perhaps a little disappointing, the debate that word has triggered in the country. I even use the word triggered with care. But it certainly seems to have ignited a fairly volatile debate about whether Canada's history includes genocide. There's a very clear definition of genocide. There's a very clear UN-accepted definition of genocide, and the history with Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, and particularly with women and girls, meets the criteria of that definition. Very, very difficult to debate that fact. But Canadians, I don't think, want our country associated with that word. It is horrific. It's horrible. And each of us needs to sort of sit and reflect on the implications of that. And I think for many Canadians, it reframes our understanding of the history of the country, and certainly layers complexity onto a story that we have been taught about Canada. That perhaps doesn't include the entirety of the history. So I say all of this because I think it's just another example of this moment that we're in when we are surfacing systemic problems, problems of inequity, problems of abuse or misuse of power, problems associated with privilege, and we need to stay present with how it makes us feel, what we're learning, and what the implications might be, and how we need to move forward together to resolve, to reconcile, to seek a shared future together. So that's one thing that I'm thinking about this morning. I think the other thing that I'm thinking about this morning, I think, is something that I said a little bit later in the question, in my answer to your question, and that was what a favorite business author, Patrick Lencioni, calls the fundamental attribution error. We have a tendency in life, as we sort of navigate relationships, to judge the people around us based on the impact of their activities, but we tend to judge ourselves based on our intentions. And how interesting is it to reframe the way we navigate relationship and work and life by judging ourselves based on the impacts that we have, and judging the people around us based on their intentions, which invites us into questioning why people choose to do things, or perhaps to understand why they did things on autopilot and it wasn't a conscious choice, but to engage with questions. And, as Corey points out, just this commitment to learning all of the time. And the more we can be open to learning, I think the more we can cultivate empathy, and the more we can accept changes to our understanding of the world, including that, yes, Canada has an historic relationship with genocide.
Yeah, some incredible points. We definitely could have an entire conversation on that report,
Yeah, we could.
The term genocide and what that opens up. I think it's an extremely important dialogue that is happening around us right now. It's so fitting as part of this whole conversation about recognizing, healing, understanding, and being open. And what do we need to do to heal the systems that are no longer working, to be able to step forward and really to create this whole a bridge between this great separation that has existed. And
if I might just add one more brief thing, I think it's easy to think of genocide as a racial issue. But the inquiry was into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So it's also a gender issue. There are socioeconomic issues entangled with both of those conversations. And it's the entanglements that I think make a lot of these conversations very, very difficult. It's just so hard to tease apart one issue from another, because they're so intertwined systemically, just like those towering redwoods roots. But sometimes it's helpful to, just so that we can get our arms around the nature of a problem, it's helpful to sort of break it down into who's the agent that's responsible for inappropriate use of power, and who is the subject or the object that's receiving that inappropriate use of power, and how can we tease apart the Gordian knot of all of this inequity and untangle it bit by bit.
Thank you so much for that. Ben, I'm going to remind you what you said in answer to that question, the number one conversation you hope men and women are engaging in right now. You said coming to a better understanding of how to center or ground yourself to experience more success with less effort, and as a result, becoming a brighter, more positive light in the world. And wondering if there's anything like you'd like to say to dig a little deeper into that.
Well, I don't think it's so much a conversation between men and women as much as people in general. And I think like, and I try to do this myself. I try to kind of every day I try to feel like everybody I come into contact with, if it's an hour, or if it's a day, if it's a minute, I want them to be uplifted by coming into contact with me in one way or another. If I make them smile, if I make them, compliment them in one way or another, I want to make people. I want to bring everybody I come into contact with, I want to bring them up a little bit. I want their life to be better for having come into contact with me. And I think, so in that way, I think that you give what you get, or you get what you give. So I mean, this is basic stuff, right? So I think that as far as between men and women, I think men and women, I think we need to look just at people in general. I think you need to give compassion, and you need to give understanding, we need to give empathy, and we need to give all these things that we want to receive, and we will receive that in return. So there's definitely, even if you look at it like there's an ulterior motive here, it's a good ulterior motive. You get what you give. And so I would definitely like to say that. And I also wanted to say, kind of going back off topic, back to what we were talking about before, just some of the things that we need to, the tsunami kind of things that need to happen. I know from my own experience, observation, and also from my own experience that you can recreate yourself in a second. You can recreate yourself in a second, but you can't look back. So I think when we're having conversations, like these big conversations, it's important to remember, but you also, if you really want to create change, you got to look forward. And I think that all of us, community-wise, globally, we need to look forward, and we need to continually look at the change we're trying to create within the way we communicate, men and women, globally, the changes we're looking in the world, and just look forward. Like I say, I know from personally, you can recreate yourself like that. It takes that long. Then you just got to look forward. You can't look back. You just can't. If you're struggling with whatever it is, like a drug addiction, alcoholism or whatever, as much as people think these changes it's a long process, it's not. It's just you can't look back though. You can only see yourself as you want to be. If you want to kick the habit of, or if you want to be thin, if you've been overweight your whole life and you want to be thin, only see yourself as thin, recreate yourself as thin, never look back. Don't look back. And I think that's the same with globally. I think that's the same with just a lot of things as far as recreating ourselves. It's not very hard. It's just we have to continually think forward. And, and again, I just think that as far as the communication between men and women, I think it's the communication between people and nations, and like just on a bigger scale, you receive what you get what you give. So we just need to be conscious of what we're giving, as far as compassion and love and all these universally desired things.
I think the one thing that jumps out for me about what you said is, I imagine the change, the impact that we could have if we approached every single interaction and every encounter with the intention of making sure that the person or the group that we're interacting with ends up being just a little bit, feeling a little bit better about themselves for having interacted with us. I know one of the mentors that I have, a quote that he often uses is "expect magic in every encounter." And so I try hard to remember that when I'm walking into a meeting or even into a conversation, to really expect that magic. I have one more question that I want to dive into, but I'm really curious, was there anything like super top of mind, any reflections on what any of you said or answered in that last question I just wanted to make sure if anyone had anything to add that I wasn't jumping forward.
Charlene, what kept coming up for me is, I think as a human species, we want this sense of clarity, because with clarity, there's confidence, and we always strive to minimize things to it's black or white, it's yes or no, to do these decisions. And, they say it's not black or white, it's in the gray area. And I don't think it's gray. I think it's technicolor. And really what we're talking about is more like a kaleidoscope. And if you think of, when we're a kid, when we looked at a kaleidoscope, how magnificent and how cool that was, and how we're discovering more and more every time we're turning it and doing something with it and approaching it. It's never seemingly the same. And I think it's that sort of approach and maybe mindset that needs to be invited versus trying to bring it to minimalist and come to a decision. I don't think it's a decision to be made. It's polarities that need to be managed and manifested and just embraced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the kaleidoscope. I love that. Okay, I am going to jump into our last question. And that is, in terms of moving forward, in terms of mobilizing, what do you think is the number one thing we could do or focus on that would break down barriers and build bridges, bringing leaders together, all leaders, all genders, all races at this time? What do you think is the lowest hanging fruit at this time in terms of building bridges and breaking down those barriers to bring people together? And just wondering, I'm going to use it kind of as closing thoughts and reflections as well. And so Corey, I'll start again with you. What do you think where should our focus be? I know I always throw it your way. Where should our focus be? What's the lowest hanging fruit?
I actually made notes on this because
Great.
I knew this question was coming and there was thoughts that came up. So, this is raw. I'm reminded of a good friend of mine, Phyllis Webstad. And those that don't know that name, she came up with Orange Shirt Day. And the reason I bring up Phyllis is she used her story, but more importantly, what I have personally found and a value I hold is, in our weakness, sometimes we're made strong. And she took this point of vulnerability and weakness and a tragedy from her childhood and has become this great point of strength. And I've been very privileged to be the person to do the research behind this and what's led to this whole movement, worldwide movement around this. And I like the idea of, we're strong in our weakness. Mm-hmm. And I think people think that weak is vulnerable and that's a bad thing. And it's that capitalist and that mentality from the past 10,000 years that Ben talked about. I also love what Mike had talked about before. We need to do just one thing. And I'm reminded of City Slickers and Old Curly, just pick one thing. If we try and tackle the whole bear in front of us, it's too overwhelming. So, pick, one thing that can be a positive change that as an individual we can move forward with. The other thing that I think we can do is ask the question, what do I need to learn? Because we're all have a certain degree of ignorance coming into the conversation. So what is it I need to learn and understand? And then I'll share, what I'm doing and what in my piece is we want to provide opportunities for people who aren't privileged. So just us being here in Canada or North America and having access to resource and that to do what we're doing puts us in a position of privilege and blessing. And I think one thing that we can all do if we're coming at it from that point is a redistribution of that privilege and blessing. So a few things we do is, we want to give education to children and individuals who have positive intention and impact they want to make that wouldn't have that opportunity if it wasn't, provided to them by someone that is coming from a point of privilege. And the second is redistribution of wealth. So part of what we do as an organization and my business colleagues and partners is we're taking a bunch of our profits to do different things. And, one thing right now is we're opening up lines to do business with the country of Georgia and Eastern Europe and investing heavily ourselves in some infrastructure and business enterprises there, but also inviting others. And in Northern India, we set up some sewing centers that help fund children to go to school. And the funds from the sewing centers are then able to give women in the community and men who are in extreme poverty, the most extreme poverty any of us can imagine, to learn a trade that they then get to go work for tailors. Everyone gets a meal, at least 1 or 2 meals a day, which, was not even an option in the past. So, we can all do little things with the little we have, and that ripple impact, because we know that those people that get touched will then go back to the community, share that story, and want to do more because they see what it did for them. So they then are able to, once they get some blessing and privilege, be able to bless others.
Awesome. Oh, great nuggets in there. Mike, in terms of that number one thing, if you had to pick one or lowest hanging fruit that you see right now, what would you say that is?
So I'll be brief, just in the interest of time. I know our clock is pressed. There's 2 things that are tied in my mind. I'm reminded again and again of the commitment to seek first, to understand, right? To show up with the questions, to invite the conversation, to learn, and to learn about the people around us and what's motivating them. But the second thing, speaking for myself, I have the privilege of sitting in a few roles that give me authority, that give me attention, that give me power. And the appropriate use of that authority and power is to give it away, to create space for the people around me that don't have that privilege and power to take advantage of it, and thereby to lift all of us. So the work that I need to be doing is around transparency and around shared power, and around creating the space for wise, healthy, collective decision making.
Yeah, I love that. Lowest hanging fruit, number one focus. What do you see in terms of building bridges and breaking down barriers? What are our next steps?
I think the lowest hanging fruit is vulnerability and honesty. And I'm just going to tell a really quick story. So I was teaching a fitness class years ago, and a lady friend of mine was in the class, and we were very tight friends, but she was very insulted by something that happened in the class. And I really didn't understand what it was. All I knew is she was really mad at me, very, very mad at me. So I didn't want to fight with her. I wanted to be her friend. So I just said, listen, I'm sorry. I don't know what I did wrong. I'm not sure what I did to upset you, but whatever it was, I'm just really sorry. And I want us to be, move on and be friends and get along. And in many ways it transformed our friendship and made it better. And I think that in the world and imagine if every nation said, imagine in a Pollyanna world if every nation said, you know what do you need from me? Let's not fight anymore. What do you need from me? And what if every man and woman said, listen, what do you need from me? What do you need? And we listened, we were vulnerable. Listen, I don't want to be hurt, but I don't want to hurt you either. So what do you need from me? And so I think vulnerability and honesty, admitting that, I'm afraid, but I want to make you better. I want to be happier because I've made you better and you can make me. So I think vulnerability and honesty personally and globally is really the lowest hanging fruit.
Well, we covered a lot of territory, and it is 9 o'clock this morning. So I do honor your time, and thank you very much for being part of Men Who Mobilize this morning. This is the first in a series. We're just going to keep doing these dialogues, having these conversations, and doing what we can a little bit at a time. So I want to thank you very much for being part of it, and also thank you for who you are and how you show up in the world every day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.